Hi there. Welcome to the talk on plants and photosynthesis presented to you by Bonolo Mokoatsi from the University of Johannesburg. In this lecture, we will touch on the oxygen catastrophe, what plants are, what photosynthesis is, and why South Africa is a special place. On the hierarchy of models, this talk is sitting on number 5. And so far we've learned about the bare rock, which rendered the earth too cold, and we learned about the static atmosphere and oceans that made the earth too hot. And later we moved on to moving atmosphere and ocean. And we also learned about drifting continents, which touched on climate change, ice ages, and the evolution. Now we are sitting at number 5. We are adding life to the model, and we are paying particular attention to oxygen and the carbon cycles. And this is what I will be telling you about. So now we know that sunlight is an essential energy source, and we know that water is the prerequisite for life, especially liquid water, because it facilitates the transfer of genetic information. Now I will take you through the importance of sunlight and water in plants and photosynthesis. But first, we must understand the origin of plants. At about 2.5 billion years ago, at the beginning of the Proterozoic eon, oxygen emerged into the atmosphere for the first time. This was the product of cyanobacteria. This bacteria is aquatic and photosynthetic. This means that it lives in water bodies and it produces oxygen and its own food. So because of cyanobacteria, oxygen was available now in water bodies, especially in the oceans, and over time this accumulated to toxic levels, and as a result the oxygen was released into the atmosphere. The release of oxygen into the atmosphere caused the first mass extinction, and this is why we call this event a catastrophe, because organisms had not been adapted to such an environment. And later now we learned that the oxygen reacted with iron to create iron oxides, and we see this on sedimentary rocks as a reddish color, and these are called banded iron formations. They're just layered pieces of sedimentary rock that have visual evidence of oxygen having reacted with the iron inside the sedimentary rock. So what are plants then? Plants emerged as a result of cyanobacteria occupying eukaryotes, and in exchange of a home, the cyanobacteria produced food for the eukaryotes. And these eukaryotes later evolved into differentiated species, and plants being one of those. So the typical structure of a leaf involves a root, and from the root grows the stem, from which grows different branches, and from the branches we get the leaves, flowers, and fruit. But for today's talk, I want to particularly focus on the leaf, since this is the factory of photosynthesis. Have you ever wondered why leaves are green? Leaves are green because of the green pigment chlorophyll, which absorbs red and blue light and reflects strongly green light in the electromagnetic spectrum. As you can see in the structure of a leaf, you have the mesophyll cells, which contain stomata and the chloroplasts. The stomata is the respiratory system in which carbon dioxide is inhaled by the stomata, and this exhales the oxygen. And in the mesophyll cell you also find chloroplasts, which contain chlorophylls and other components, but we are particularly interested in the chlorophyll because it is responsible for the absorption of energy from sunlight. So, what is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is a process through which plants produce their own food. And in this process, plants use sunlight energy to convert carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and oxygen. This picture shows us the photosynthetic activity within chloroplasts. And at the top there we have the equation of photosynthesis, which shows 6 carbon dioxide molecules reacting with 6 hydrogen water molecules with the help of light to produce sugar and oxygen. Photosynthesis can be divided into 2 processes, the one being a light-dependent process. The other one is a light-independent process, and that's also known as the Kelvin cycle. In the light-dependent cycle, plants harness energy from sunlight and turn it into chemical energy. Light energy is absorbed by the chlorophyll and energizes the electrons within the pigment molecules. The loss of electrons produces ATP enzyme as well as the NADPH, which later stores this energy for the other light-independent process. And on the other side, in the Kelvin cycle, energy is harnessed from ATP and NADPH enzymes, transfers the electrons from loose hydrogen, which then react with carbon dioxide to produce sugar. But this process happens in such that during the transfer of electrons, carbon dioxide is reduced, and this means that it receives more negatively charged electrons, whereas the water is oxidized, meaning it loses electrons, and ultimately we get sugar out of this process. So the Kelvin cycle is particularly important for carbon fixation, and this is, in simple terms, the conversion of inorganic carbon to organic compounds. And this also facilitates carbon fluxes between various carbon pools. A carbon flux is the transfer of carbon between one carbon pool to another, and this is only possible because of photosynthesis. But carbon is fixed differently by different plants, because we have C3 plants, C4 plants, and CAM plants. In C3 plants, photosynthesis produces a 3-carbon compound, which is then, through the carbon cycle, is broken down to produce sugar. Whereas in C4 plants, we initially get 4 carbon compounds, which are then split into a C3 compound and a carbon dioxide molecule. And the carbon dioxide molecule then undergoes the Kelvin cycle to produce sugar. And in CAM plants, we find that energy is stored during the day. So these plants collect or rather store sunlight energy during the day to facilitate the Kelvin cycle that happens during the night. So at night, only then the carbon is fixed. So how do plants actually make Earth habitable? I mean, we are talking about the Earth being habitable, and plants do have a hand in making this Earth of ours habitable. Because first of all, plants are primary food producers. They are right at the bottom of the food chains. They also absorb atmospheric carbon dioxide, and they produce oxygen for other living organisms. They also moderate carbon dioxide through carbon fixation and through the carbon cycle and carbon fluxes to transfer carbon from one pool to another. So, South Africa, as you know, is a special place, but why? In terms of plants, South Africa is the only country in the world to have its own floral kingdom. How cool is that? This means we have a rich biodiversity, we have varied fruit and vegetables, we have abundant medicine, and to name a few, we have spirulina, we have muchina, we have African potato, we have legala, alu, you name it. And we also have some breathtaking aesthetics. They're just the beauty of driving around the Namakwa land. And, you know, because of this, we have a booming tourism because, I mean, everybody wants to see this beauty. And I would strongly recommend that you take on that trip to see it for yourself. So, we've reached the end of our talk. And now we conclude that water and solar energy are essential for life. And through food and oxygen production, plants actually make Earth habitable. South Africa is rich in plant biodiversity, thus making it a really special place. And we are going to learn more about biodiversity in our next talk. So stay tuned. Cheers.